Well, now we're covering Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 46. But it may be that we'll go into chapter 23, even though that's not part of this particular lesson. The reason for that is I've noticed there are not very many views, not many watching this video, so maybe we need to move along a little bit faster. There were repeated attempts made by the religious elite to set a trap for Jesus by asking him what they believed to be very difficult questions that he would not be able to answer. They wanted to make him look bad in front of the people, but instead Jesus made them look bad. In Matthew 22, going back to what we've already studied, Matthew 22, verse 15, then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk. And then they asked him this question about paying taxes. Well, how did that end? Not very well for them. Verse 22 says, "But when they heard these things, they marveled and left him and went their way." So then in verse 23, the questions just kept coming. The same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him, and they asked him a question about the resurrection of the dead. And they were doing this in order to set a trap for him. That didn't work out for them. It says in verse 33, and when the multitudes heard this, they heard his response to their question, they were astonished at his teaching. And then in verse 34 it says, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, so they're huddling up, deciding how they're going to try to set the net for Jesus. And they sent this lawyer with this question that we're going to be considering now about which is the greatest commandment in the law. How did the chapter end? Well, it ends with verse 46, Matthew 22:46, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was deity. Verse 14 says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now, if God left heaven and came to the earth and lived in a body of flesh, then we would expect certain things of him. First of all, we would expect him to display a great deal of power. Well, Jesus, he walked on water. He fed the multitudes with just a small amount of food. We'd expect him to display great wisdom. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and this lawyer, they were no match for him. Now, first of all, a lawyer asked, which is the great commandment in the law? That's in verses 34 through 40 of Matthew chapter 22. And Jesus is going to answer by saying, well, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Now, the rabbis had counted 613 commandments. They were very meticulous in this. They counted 248 positive and 365 negative commandments. And then there was this long standing debate among themselves about which one was the most important. Would it be a commandment regarding circumcision? Maybe a commandment regarding the Sabbath? But now in verses 34 through 48, we'll see how Jesus answered. It says, but when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. That's why he's asking the question, not because he wants to know, but he's testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And then he continued to answer. We'll be reading that in just a moment. But here he quoted Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, and which says essentially just love him with your total being, every fiber of your being. Love God. So, what was the wisdom in answering that way? Well, God knows that if we love Him with every fiber of our being, then all of His law will be obeyed. No one commandment should ever stand above another commandment, like circumcision being elevated above Sabbath keeping, or Sabbath keeping being elevated above circumcision. God knows that if He has your heart, soul, and mind, that He will have your obedience, your total obedience. He'll have your prayers. He'll have your worship. He'll have your time and energy spent on this earth. But then He went on and answered, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Matthew 22:39 and 40. And the second is like it, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then He said, "On these two commandments," love God, love your neighbor, "on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So He quoted Leviticus 19, verse 18, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And if we obey this, then every command regulating our interaction with others on this earth will be obeyed. Now, the Apostle Paul made reference to this in the book of Romans, chapter 13, beginning with verse 8. "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet, and if there is any other commandment, are all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." He said love is the fulfillment of the law because love does no harm to a neighbor. If you love your neighbor as yourself, well, then you're not going to murder him, but you're going to obey that commandment. If you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to steal what he has. You're not going to bear false witness against him so that he's treated unfairly. You're not going to covet what he has. And so no wonder, he said, and then if there's any other commandment, he said they're all summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, again, in Matthew 22 and verse 40, right after he said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, he said, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. All of the laws of God stem from or grow out of these two commandments. Now, the third question that I gave you was, as long as we love God and our neighbor. Now, this is what some people are saying today. I'm quoting what many people are saying. Well, just as long as we love God and we love our neighbor, it doesn't matter what else we believe or practice. Well, how would you respond to that? If we love God and our neighbor, then we're going to be devoted to showing love, honor, and respect to God and to our neighbor. And John chapter 14, verse 15, Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. If you love me, you're going to keep my commandments. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. So we're going to ask, well, which ones are important? Which commands are important, and which commands that come from God are not so important? The one who loves God doesn't ask. And so the wisdom of Jesus in how he answered the lawyer's question. And then Jesus asked a question that they couldn't answer. And that's in verses 41 through 46. First, he asked, whose son was the Christ? That's in Matthew 22, 41 and 42. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them. Now, they've been asking Jesus all of these questions, trying to set the trap for him, not successful, and now Jesus turns the tables. He asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. So he's asking what the scriptures had prophesied about the Christ who was to come into the world. Well, they knew from Old Testament scriptures like 2 Samuel chapter 7, 12 through 16, and Psalm 132, verse 11, that he would be a descendant of David. We can read it here in 2 Samuel chapter 7, 12 through 16. When your days are fulfilled, God said to David, and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from before you. And your house, God said to David, your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. According to all these words and according to all this vision, so Nathan spoke to David. So God was speaking to David through his prophet Nathan concerning the establishment of his kingdom. And the king sitting on that throne would be of his body, the seed of his body. In Psalm 132, verse 11, the Lord has sworn in truth to David, he will not turn from it. I will set upon your throne the fruit of your body. Now, of course, the Pharisees, they thought that Jesus was not the Christ. But then Jesus asked them the question that they couldn't answer. That's in verses 43 through 46. Here we read in Matthew 22, verse 43, he said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. That's Psalm 110, verse 1. And then Jesus said, if David then calls him Lord, how is he a son? And no one was able to answer him a word. Nor from that day on did anyone dare question him any more. The question is, if David called the Christ Lord, that is, someone who is in authority over him and in existence before him and during the time that David lived, then how could he be David's descendant who would come after him? And the answer is that the Christ would be both God and man. And that was something that the Pharisees were overlooking. Romans 1, 1 through 4. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God, which he promised before through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, concerning his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who was born of the seed of David according to the flesh, and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. And so the Christ would be, well, our Lord, born of the seed of David, coming after David. He would come much after David, according to the flesh. But then declared to be the Son of God, deity, or power, or God rather, declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. When God raised Jesus from the dead, this declared him to be clearly and plainly who he claimed to be, and that is God. God in the flesh. The Jews rejected Jesus as the Christ, at least in part because they did not understand that the Christ would be deity or God. Their concept of David's son was only fleshly, and they were looking for an earthly kingdom. No wonder they did not recognize Jesus when he came. Jesus put them on the spot. He asked them a question that they just could not wrap their minds around. Well, so we need to finish this lesson and this chapter where we started, and that's with Matthew 22, verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. They're huddling up, trying to decide how they're going to destroy Jesus. You know, it would have been to the Pharisees' credit if Matthew 22, verse 34 would read, "But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they too were astonished at his doctrine, so that they believed that Jesus was the Christ." But that's not how the verse reads. They did not want to believe. Why is it that so many today do not believe? It is not that the evidence is weak or insufficient. It is because they don't want to believe. In many cases, it is because of their hardened and stubborn hearts. And we could pile evidence on top of evidence on top of evidence, and they would never believe. And their hearts are just like the hearts of those Pharisees and Sadducees who wanted to destroy Jesus. Let's make sure that our hearts are like the hearts of the Bereans. They're complemented by the scriptures in Acts chapter 17, verse 11. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether those things were so. That was their only interest, to find out what was so, what was true. And they searched the scriptures every day. Well, let's go ahead and let's go into what we're calling Lesson 42, Matthew 23, 1 through 22. We're not going to cover all 22 verses. We'll only cover a few, maybe the first 12 verses. It seems that Jesus is still in the temple as he is issuing these rebukes to the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. You go to Matthew chapter 21 and verse 23. Matthew 21, verse 23. Now when he came into the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people confronted him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" Now they asked this question as he came into the temple. Then you go to Matthew 24 and verse 1, and it says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple." So it seems like in Matthew 22 and also in Matthew 23 that Jesus is doing this teaching while he is in the temple. Here are some of the most scathing rebukes that Jesus gave, and many of them beginning with the words, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." The word translated woe it denotes a kind of a mingling together of doom and sorrow. Many have contrasted it with the Beatitudes. Now, blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. This would be the opposite of that. How bad it's going to be for you is what he's saying. The expression of doom along with sorrow. This was not just for the benefit of the scribes and Pharisees that Jesus rebuked them. This was a warning to others of that day, lest they be misled by those teachers. And it is also a warning to us today, lest we become like them. An outline of the chapter can be summed up as follows. Matthew 23, 1 through 12. Christ speaks to the multitude and his disciples, warning them against the scribes and the Pharisees. And then Matthew 23, 13 through 36, Christ speaks to the scribes and Pharisees directly. So let's look first of all now at verses 1 through 12. Spend just a few minutes with this, and that will be all. Christ speaks to the multitudes and his disciples about the scribes and Pharisees. There are three things that he said about them. One, that they refused to live by the rules and regulations they imposed on others. That's in Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." They prided themselves as being teachers of the law of Moses. And that's what he has in mind when he says they sit in Moses' seat as teachers. A teaching office is what that would describe. But they failed as teachers because they didn't live up to what they taught. And the Apostle Paul, over in the book of Romans, chapter 2, verses 17 through 24, I believe that this is a good commentary on what Jesus is saying there. Romans 2:17, Paul said, "Indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest on the law, and make your boast in God, and know his will, and approve the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law." And so they really felt good about themselves as teachers, sitting in Moses' seat. But then Paul lowered the boom on those Jews in Romans 2, beginning with verse 21, when he said, "You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you not rob temples? You who make your boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written." Now, the law that they taught but didn't live up to, the law had stiff requirements. But then the Pharisees went further and they threw in their own traditions. And some of them, Jesus said here in Matthew 23, they didn't lift a finger to keep themselves. And so they refused to live by the rules that they were imposing on others. Another thing that he spoke to the multitudes and disciples about when he was condemning the scribes and the Pharisees is that they loved the attention of men. And that's in Matthew 23, verses 5 through 7. They love the attention of men. But all their works they do to be seen by men. They make their phylacteries broad and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. That they loved the attention of men and they were doing their religion just for show is seen in three things, as Jesus said there in those verses we just read. It's seen in what they wore, it is seen in where they sat, and it is seen in how they liked to be addressed by men. It was seen in what they wore. Their phylacteries, they made broad their phylacteries. These phylacteries were pieces of parchment with scripture written on them. And they were worn on the wrist or the forehead. There wasn't anything wrong with wearing those, except that it was wrong for them to do it because they were making them broad where everybody could see how religious and pious they were. And then there's the reference to the borders of their garments in verse 5. A requirement of the law of Moses is found in Numbers 15 if you want a little bit of background about the borders of their garment and what Jesus is referring to here in Matthew 23. Going to read now in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, verses 37 through 40. He says in verse 37, "Again the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassels of the corners. And you shall have the tassel." Now, what was the purpose of this? "That you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined, and that you may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy for your God. All right, so there's the background. There's the reason they were to wear those. What was the problem? Well, the Pharisees, they enlarged the borders of their garments. They had a show-off religion, you might say. So they love the attention of men. It's seen in what they wore. It's also seen in where they sat. Again, in the book of Matthew 23, verse 6, they love the best places at feast. That would be the places of honor at feast, and the best seats in the synagogues. And then it's seen in how they like to be addressed. Verse 7, they love to be addressed with greetings in the marketplaces and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. Well, they just wanted to be fawned over by men, to be seen as important. The term rabbi literally means my great one. And so it was a title of honor that no one should ever bestow on any man. All right, now here are the admonitions given to the multitudes and his disciples as we read in Matthew 23, verses 8 through 12, and draw our study to a conclusion. Now, remember that he is speaking to the multitudes and his disciples. Matthew 23, verse 1, then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples. And he's still speaking to them in verses 8 through 12. And he says here, but you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and all you are brethren. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your Father, he who is in heaven. And do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. First of all, he said, just do not be called rabbi. One teacher is to be exalted above all others. Just one is to be exalted in that way. And we are all equals, he says there in verse 8. Do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher. One is to be exalted above all others. One is your teacher, the Christ. And then he said, you are all brethren. That is, we're all equals. There is no hierarchy in the church. No hierarchy. We're all equals. We're all brethren. And then he said in verse 9, do not call anyone on earth your father. Now, a father there would be condemned as a title of rank and honor. There's only one Father, he says. Matthew 6, verse 9, in the model prayer, we're to address God as our Father in heaven. Hallowed be your name. And Ephesians 4, verse 6, there's one God and Father of all, who is above all, through all, and in you all. And then he said in verse 10 of Matthew 23, do not be called teachers. Now, that's the honorary use of the term that's being condemned, the honorary use of the term. And it's just a repeat of Matthew 23, verse 8, where he said, do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ. One is your teacher, and you're all brethren. And so here in verse 10, he says, do not be called teachers, for one is your teacher, the Christ. So we can understand verse 8, then we really understand what he's saying in verse 10. And then he said in verses 11 and 12, whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Well, that's what the Pharisees, the Sadducees were doing. They were exalting themselves, and they're going to be brought low, he said. The love of honor has absolutely no place in the kingdom. The love of preeminence, to be prominent in the kingdom, that has no place. The greatness is measured by service. Those who seek to serve others are the ones who will be exalted or honored by God. What would Jesus' teaching, which begins in verse 8, condemn today? Well, a couple of things I'll mention, and the lesson will be yours. First of all, it would condemn the clergy laity system that is in place today. Uh, Jesus said, "Do not call anyone rabbi. You are all brethren. You're all equals." What's the clergy laity system? Well, the clergy would be recognized as the professionals in religion, the ones you look up to, the professionals. The laity would be the common people who are dependent upon the expert knowledge of the clergy. And that is just not taught in the Bible. But it is taught here that we're all brethren. There's no hierarchy. We're all brethren. We're all the same. And then another thing that Jesus' teaching would condemn would be the use of modern day titles. We should not address men in those terms. Men should not want to be addressed in those ways. The use of the word rabbi, holy father, and that's the people today refer to the Catholic Pope as Holy Father. We need to understand that one is your father. The title reverend. Reverend is used in the scriptures in Psalm 111, verse 9. It says, "Holy and reverend is his name." One is worthy of the title of reverend, and that's God. That's a reference to God. Holy and reverend is his name. The New King James says, "Holy and awesome is his name," because the word reverend means one who's worthy of awe and respect and honor. No man on the earth is worthy of that kind of awe. Holy and awesome is his name. Holy and reverend is his name. And so we learn a great deal from Jesus' teaching here in Matthew chapter 23. We're going to continue in Matthew 23 in our video next week, where Christ speaks to the scribes and Pharisees, and he speaks to them directly. And we'll see if we go into chapter 24 at that time. Thank you.